I'm really happy for you because I know how hard you work. So mostly, I'm just really excited for you that the show is so beautiful and so well received. So
thank you.
Congratulations. So yeah, I mean, honestly. All right, so yes, as Bill mentioned, I'm Shana Nys Dambrot. I'm the arts editor at the LA Weekly and a million other things, and most of you have probably come across me at some point. Andy Moses and I have been friends for a really upsetting number of years, like a really like a half
years.
my life type situation, like a 23-year, I don't even know. Like I moved here in 1995 and we even had some cross currents in New York before that. So whatever, that's it. That's my whole life. So among other things, I kind of watched all of this happen from the beginning. And so it's really exciting to be able to have this conversation tonight that kind of and I love a pun too, and the one I'm going to use now is full circle. Because there is so much in this work, and I almost wish we could have 4 conversations simultaneously because of the way that it's all kind of layered and interconnected. Tell everybody what we're looking at.
Everything in the show was actually made this year in 2023, but I pretty much started the exhibition with this pearlescent white painting over here. I made it in January, and it was sort of like dialing the clock back and sort of starting where I began this whole body of work in 2002 and 2003. I lived in New York from 82 until 2000, and then I sold my loft in New York in 2001, moved out here. For a brief second, I had a shack on the beach in Malibu. Shack, when I say shack, 800 square feet, but the deck touched the water, and I would stand out there. It was a nice relief from moving back from New York.
The opposite of New York.
What is
the opposite of New York? Right.
And I would stand on my tiny little deck and watch the water lap up over it, and I would see these 2 planes, the sky, the water, and just the amount of time I spent there and the amount of time that I saw these 2 things sometimes connecting, sometimes separating, reflecting each other. Everything constantly changed. And it reminded me of where I grew up. I actually grew up on a street, Mayberry Road, Santa Monica Canyon, overlooking the ocean, and I would walk to that cliff from the time I was about 4 years old until I moved out when I was 17 years old. Pretty much, it was a ritual. It was like a daily experience. I'd walk to the cliff, watch the sunset. And again, that play of light, you'd look a little north, it was sort of a northwest direction, and the way the wind would hit the water and the way the sky would reflect off it, it was a constant theater. It was constantly moving, changing, shifting, but you felt so connected to the water, to the earth, to sort of the larger cosmos, if you will, because it was kind of a stunning view.
Yeah.
And I didn't think about it that much.
By the way,
Go ahead.
You also were getting in that water.
I was surfing.
You weren't just staying on the cliff and looking
surfing.
at the water. You were in it.
From 13 to 17, I think I surfed twice a day, every single day. And I didn't really pay that much attention in school because I was very tired.
Yes.
And it was hard to focus. So surfing was my life. It was what I would see every day, and the reflections off the water, the movement of the water. It went into my subconscious in a way that I probably didn't even realize at the time. So then I went to Cal Arts, which was a school that was telling you your position in the art world, and the year it is, now you need to make work that says this because art has evolved in this very nuanced way up to now. So you get to do this, and the next person gets to do that. That's sort of what I was taught. I went there for 2 years. It was a great education, don't get me wrong, I loved it. But it felt like it was missing something for me in my life. So I went to New York. I was supposed to work for a painter named David Sally. And when I got there, he said, unfortunately, I hired someone else, but I have another painter, Pat Steer, and you can work for her. So I worked for Pat, and she was kind of an amazing painter, and she really talked about painting. So it was a good way to get out of the CalArts mode
I
of
was going to
thinking.
say, to kind of counteract whatever.
And really get lost in painting. And
CalArts was a very anti-painting.
It was.
Well, ironically, though, so many of the people that you were there with in that anti-painting indoctrination went on to become incredible painters.
Yeah.
That happened.
I mean, some became incredible painters,
yeah.
and some became incredible conceptual artists, too.
No doubt, but it's fun. It's always funny
well.
to me how many painters came out of that specific period at that place. Yeah.
And again, I grew up around painting. My father was an abstract painter, so I saw it in my house every day, but he would always tell me and my brother, we could do anything we wanted, but we just couldn't be painters. So that...
Challenge accepted. Well,
Yeah. So I did go to CalArts. I went to CalArts as a filmmaker, funny enough, and I made some films. And
Cover
while I was
story.
there, I made a show called Father Knows Best, where I made reproductions of my late father's paintings and then smashed them up at the opening.
Oh my God.
But it was interesting. So
I'm sorry,
I was
that will never not be funny.
I was kind of making a statement to free myself up, because I would walk down the halls and everyone would say, there's Ed's son, there goes Ed's son. So it was a way of disassociating from that, and it actually worked.
Right, but at the same time, hidden within that, at the core of that, was like an excuse to make a bunch of paintings.
It was, but I just thought I'm going to knock these paintings out. But the interesting thing was, the first time I touched paint, I've heard what other people say about heroin. It's like, you just know that this is it. You've never experienced anything better than this. It's the best feeling you've ever had in your life, and you just want more. So that's where it all began, and that's where it continues to this day. I think it'll continue until I'm no longer here, or just right on the edge.
Yeah.
But so that's really, it was a way of, it took coming back to LA to reconnect with something that was here in the environment, not the artwork that was here, even though there was a great movement of artwork from the 60s and 70s, light in space. But I kind of discovered these paintings and why I wanted to make them more from my personal experience than looking at art history.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's funny you mention art history, because when we talk about who some of your cousins from art history might be, they might not be the ones that you would immediately think about aesthetically. For example, you and I talk about Turner all the time. Nutshell version of why we do that is because Turner was an abstract painter in search of a word for that. Like, it didn't exist, right? It wasn't a thing. Like, you didn't bother saying figurative painting. There was only painting. And so he wanted so desperately to work another kind of way and to speak another kind of language that he managed to kind of like invent a modality in which he could go paint things like sunrise behind the fog, or the head of steam off a locomotive in a rainstorm. And if you go and if you look at like Simon Schama's incredible Power of Art series, where he goes to like the bits of coastline where Turner lived, or, he would lash himself to like the front of a ship to go see what the middle of a storm looked like. And then, right, crazy, but like, so he found a way to paint things that looked abstract, but again, without
Absolutely.
that word. And so he had this really brutal, passionate relationship with like, what is the landscape and what is the natural phenomenon and what is this other thing that he would have called abstraction if he could. And I feel like that's such a good kind of ancestor for you, because what you just finished talking about in terms of the way that you notice the coast and the water and the ocean horizon is that thing. And that's where these started. And we were talking a little bit about, because I have a small one from that time, and you're right, this is the most like that beginning, where you consciously made an effort to kind of stop at like one, or at least one definitely main horizon line, so that anybody looking at the work that thought it was a horizon line were correct about that. It was in there. And then over the last 20 years, that's gone away. It's become multiplied. It's become torqued. they're still kind of phenomenological, but in different ways now.
Right.
And they've gone into, so, it was kind of counterintuitively external in the beginning. But then over the last 20 years, that gets you through to like the newest work. A lot of that got recalibrated, and a lot of it has to do with you living in your childhood home again and settling in and the energy of that. And so there's a million things that come in and out of the evolution of the work. I know you mentioned about halfway through it, like 2015, you suddenly really became aware that you were starting to let some of that go.
So we're talking about J.M.W. Turner, not Bill.
No relation,
so
or maybe there is. I don't know, there
paintings
isn't.
From the 1820s through the 1850s
maybe there
mostly.
Is a relation, let's say.
And I didn't grow up around art history. I grew up around contemporary painting. I did love Rothko, and it was in a Rothko catalog, I think in 80 or 81 I was looking, and there were images of Turner's paintings then saying he was a big influence. And that, he was sort of the first one, at least that I can think of, that was really moving towards abstraction out of landscape at maybe the earliest point in the 1850s. Some of his paintings in the 1850s had like one little speck of something else, so they were pretty much abstract paintings beyond that. Exactly. So it was, when I went to London in 82 and finally saw them in person, they kind of blew my mind. And that was definitely a starting out point for thinking about light and these kind of fields in a certain way. It made a big impact on me. But yeah, the work, this work, when I first started making them, again, I made one pearlescent white one. It was very simple. It was flat. I thought, if it curves, the light and everything, the atmosphere is just going to move around a lot more. I was living in Malibu, looking out, seeing the curvature of the earth, and it really inspired me to start curving. I first started the convex ones, but as soon as I first made the first concave painting, I knew there was something there. So I've been doing that for 20 years. As far as the imagery on them, it's gotten simpler, it's gotten more complex. I did a survey show in 2017, and I think I made some of my most complex paintings because I was doing these vertical curves, and then the sides were curved in.
Santa Monica College.
And there were some very intense colors and very intense patterning. And I love those paintings, but it was sort of, I thought, all right, I've kind of now pushed this to the limit. Where I want to go now is kind of reduce the amount of colors in each painting. And for this particular show, I really chose color palettes that I felt like over the last 20 years just succeeded the most. They really captured like a moment. So I feel like the blue one feels like a daytime painting, and this one over here could be sunset or sunrise that's in the back. This one here, a nocturne painting. And I didn't want to use, there's still a lot of color going on, but it's sort of reduced from where it once got, where it was really extreme and really kind of in your face. So I do want these paintings to have this meditative quality and yet still be very active. For me, a great painting is one that's moving. And when you stand in front of it, it looks like it's moving, and the light is changing, and the light is shifting, and it's this living object. Yeah. To me, that's like what a painting should be.
Literally, absolutely. That's what you're. And well, it's funny because the color too is so emotional, right? And so that's incredible. That's amazing. People love them. That hot pink is like, are you kidding me? But it's also very specific in that way. And so if your goal at the start of a new year, symbolized by this sort of cleansing, new dawn energy of something like this, then with that intention in mind, it absolutely makes sense that you would have pulled away from those sort of hotter emotions and into a more meditative kind of tone for the whole thing. That gold is intense, but it's soulful. It's not like sexy danger red, you know what I mean? And so they're not quiet, but they're another emotional key, and they're all very sort of consistent in that way.
And emotional is a quality I want them to have. Sensorial quality of these paintings, like there is when you see work of light and space. It's about, your sensory, your perceptions, expanding that hopefully. But I do, when I look at a Rothko, I do feel like there's an emotive value to that. And it's challenging to get that in abstract painting. And I think of these, they're abstract paintings, they're large gestures, but they're still pictorial.
Yes.
But I want that pictorial aspect to them to be, when you look at them, it's like, is that really there? Or is that something that's just in my mind? And
Yes.
I feel like with the pearlescent white painting, you look at it, it's all white. It's all one color, by the way. So every striation in it is caused through different density of paint, and literally the paint particles at different angles. There are these tiny little paint particles, so as the paint flows, I do it in a very specific way. I can't say how I do that.
That we're not going to be talking about.
But I found a way to get all these bands of color to move in these different ways and to create what looks tonally like different colors. It's one color of white.
Incredible.
So when you look at it, you go, is there a landscape in there, or is that just my imagination suggesting that?
And the answer is yes, right, to both. I mean, it's fun, but it's also true. And that's a thing. We talked about like one strategy for visual artists to exist in the current world, to get people to what I've lately taken to referring to as scrolling with our bodies, right? Like we're so used to just everything is just like rolling before us that when we walk into a room of work, we kind of do that too now. Like that's just, people are just on these conveyor belts all the time. And if you want to get people to stop, one really fun way to do that is to give them a little mystery to solve. Like, am I really seeing that?
Right.
Or, oh my God, that's all one color, and now you're moving your body around, you're trying to find an answer to your question, and now you're invested, and your attention is invested, and your body is invested, and your time, and now you actually have a chance at experiencing the work. But giving people like a gentle little thing that they have to unfurl for themselves, I think is such a beautiful, empathetic way to make art, where you're not just like letting me know what it's a picture of, please and thank you.
Right. But I think the walking around part is an important part in these, because you look from the front, there's an image, you sort of have to unravel what you're looking at. But then as you move around, the colors start to move, the colors start to shift, your experience changes. So it is something that requires a kind of interactive connection to the work. You can't just stand still. You have to come from far away, move left, move right. And the story keeps getting more complex, hopefully.
It does. And and there's so many variations of what you might see by doing that in this room. And then when you get it home or to the museum, it's going to be a whole other universe of things like that. Because when the light changes, or in this room, daytime and nighttime, that's two different universes of the effect.
You have this painting hanging over there in the back that probably has the most pearlescent color in it. So it's literally a different painting if you stand on the right or the left versus the middle. It really illuminates. And normally during the day, there's sunlight coming through the door, and then it really lights up in a way that you unfortunately can't see it now. So when these paintings are in rooms where there's overhead lighting and natural lighting, you're basically never seeing the same painting twice. It's shifting. So again, that goes back to that notion by the ocean, when you're standing there and you just see that movement. I want something. They're made by someone who once had serious ADD. So I want them to never bore you. Like you look at it one way and then 5 minutes later it's something else, and 5 minutes later it's something else.
Like the ocean.
And
that's the other thing. We talked about like another sort of not quite old enough to be like a Turner type ancestor, because still working, but like a Vija Salmon's, like the level of attention paid to the tiny little variations in the surface tension of the water, or the number of stars, and that sort of level of minute durational attention to be paid. I think that kind of energy is in there too, and that's kind of what's getting replicated in the studio in a process that shall not be discussed. However, I can say that it's basically geared towards replicating rather than depicting the kind of natural phenomenon that we're discussing. So that you're not, they remain pictorial because you're not even trying to let that stuff go. But what they actually are more like, I don't know, like reenactments or something.
That just kind of materializes and happens. So as I'm making these paintings, it's very interactive in terms of what's going on.
Very fast. Because I've heard you say this before, that there's not a lot of stopping. It's like kind of, I mean, again, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think actually part of it is like owning some of this. But again, like a surfing thing, like you have chosen the wave or the wave has chosen you, and now you are committed to that. You can't
Right.
stop in the middle of a wave and
there's
be
no
like, oh, is
stopping in
this
these
what
paintings.
the wave?
They're basically made, once I start, I
And
have to
go.
continue
Yeah.
and continue and continue, and they're shifting, changing, moving all the time.
And
Until,
that's the energy that you're seeing in them is very real. Like what you're seeing is kind of like lava flows and things where you can see the moment where the rocks hit the other rocks and stopped moving in Vasquez Canyon, or, again, like a lava flow, or, like I think Kelly's on a quest to visit every lava flow on the surface of the earth. Right? So far, so good. But like those moments where you really see when a river freezes over in winter and you really understand, that's kind of like what we're looking at here.
Right.
And so it's an idea and it's a conceptual framework, but it's very much come from this physical experience.
and it comes from years of studying how paint moves, how paint flows. So it's got this slight scientific
Science
aspect
lab,
to it.
like data spreadsheets of data and annotations. So this percentage of that and this time and this whatever, NASA level calculations.
But
Probably.
again, just studying nature in motion and then trying to recreate that in an image that's compelling. And hopefully,
Yeah.
I've achieved that.
Well, I think you have, and I love, the concept of control. This is something else that, comes up from time to time, but I hadn't thought about it in a while. But I remember, like someone said this to me, in one of my professors in college, and it like burned itself into my brain. But that there's this idea that it's counterintuitive. What you might expect is for a young artist's work to be kind of like super crazy and all over the place and just like outside the lines and just, oh my God, a bundle of and that as an artist matures, their work gets like better and tighter and, right or something. And that actually it's so often the opposite. That it's a younger artist who's trying really hard to get it right, whatever that means. And that the more you work and get to know your materials and yourself and kind of own your power, the more you can let go of even thinking about right or better or whatever and just be doing what you're doing. And so you get this looseness that actually comes later. And I've always found that a really beautiful thing to think about, because I think there are artists where that's really apparent. And I feel like you're one of them. But like now, because
Right.
it's not, you're
it's
still a young man.
Yeah. I once was a young man. It's still a little bit of both, though. It is a lot of
exactly both.
ton of control and then a ton of just letting things happen. So I have to be in this state. I don't do anything for about 3 or 4 hours before I make a painting.
Really?
I wouldn't call it meditation. My mother's a serious meditator. I wouldn't take it to that level. But I sort of have to sit in silence, not talk to anyone, not think about anything, just sort of clear out my mind. Because once I begin one of these, it's very intense, where I'm super laser focused and then super relaxed at the same time, which is a hard place to be.
Like surfing.
Like surfing. So the surfing thing for me, I realize it now. I love doing it, and I had a lot of friends that love doing it. They would always want to go where the waves were the best. I would always want to go where it was the most beautiful place to go surfing. So for me, it was very much a visual element. And the surfing part was great, but it was really more of an immersion into nature by myself, meditational and connecting to the power of the earth and the motion, and just trying to get in that state of mind. And when I came out of the water, I was in this kind of super heightened awareness state that I couldn't really achieve any other way, and totally relaxed at the same time. So fortunately, when I finish a painting, it's a very similar space that I'm in. Hopefully these can get the viewer into the same kind of space. That's the goal.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like, it's fun and kind of funny to always be like, oh, surfing. But the reality is there's a very serious conversation to be had there, because on the topic of Los Angeles and New York in the 80s and aughts and today, there was a thing for a long time. People would ask me, like when I moved here from New York, and they'd go, oh, what's the difference? So I had to come up with an answer. But I think it's true. The answer is that definitely for a really long time, and arguably still today, that beauty is regarded with skepticism.
Absolutely.
In the New York art ecosystem.
I literally had studio visits in New York where dealers would come and say, these paintings are so beautiful. And I'd say, well, thank you very much. And they said, no, don't thank me. You have a problem.
You have a... Yeah.
So I was around that, and I had a hard time. I found Nina Nose, fortunately, connected with the work and showed it. But there were a lot of people that would come to the studio and just look at the work and be dumbfounded by what I was trying to do. They just had no idea. Because I do think New York, and there's a lot of artists in this room that were in New York and had that New York experience in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It was so much about a specific dialogue in the city, and you were making work that, this kind of nuanced art history that related to this person, and this person.
Post-war Europe and different schools.
And LA was frowned upon, still somewhat is. Surfing could not be more out of vogue. It will always be out of vogue.
Oh God, the only
art
thing worse
world.
than surfing
so it's a little embarrassing
is if
talking
it's
about
spiritual.
Yeah.
That's the only thing worse.
But I'll talk about it because it was an influence in being in nature. I don't know if it's specifically surfing, but just immersing yourself in nature. Like you said, Turner would literally strap himself to the mast of a ship and go out in a storm so we could see what it looked like and then try and make a painting based on that. So these come more from that tradition than like the Beach Boys. They're not, but I do.
Although, no.
In terms of beauty, I want to make the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, because when I go to a museum, I always gravitate towards the most beautiful thing in the room, and I feel like there's a tradition there that I want to make something that hopefully in 200 years people will gravitate towards.
Yeah.
I don't want to make something that slaps someone in the face. It just has no appeal. I studied with Barbara Kruger. I love her work. I think she's one of the greatest political artists in the world.
Very slappy.
But I don't have an interest in making work like that. This is the work I make, and it's just so different.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because a lot of your early work, which I still love, where you would kind of have the newsprint and the ripped from the headlines, catastrophe headlines with your geological sampling.
So in the late 80s,
so there was a moment where you were...
Without a doubt. So I was
but
already...
those were still really beautiful.
I had moved already towards these abstract paintings in New York that looked galactic or microscopic. And then in the late 80s, I started silk screening images on them that kind of told these stories about the beginning and end of the universe on micro and macro scales. They were very complex and took forever to lay out these stories so they related to each other in these very specific ways. I still love them.
They're great paintings.
But a lot of people just stare at them and get confused.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it was sort of pushing you, and it was like they'd be in two places at once, because you wanted to kind of luxuriate and figure out how the terrestrial or cosmic parts were, and you wanted to figure out the scale, but then you were like, no, you have to know the science, and like the cosmos are coming for you, and it was very alarming. And I think that was actually kind of sort of like very of its time. I mean, we're talking about, that's pretty much the 80s
for sure.
in a nutshell, right?
And it's something I had to go through. I mean, I read a ton of science over the course of my life, and I wanted to literally kind of put it in everyone's face where these paintings were coming from and telling very specific stories. But now I feel like I can stand back, make the painting, and have it speak to you in the way it speaks to you. I mean, what's cool for me about these paintings, literally this painting, I'll have one person at the opening come over and say, oh, I was in Martha's Vineyard last summer. I saw that exact same image. And then 15 minutes later, someone will come over and say, I was in the desert last weekend. I saw those exact sand dunes and that exact sky. I know exactly what you're trying to capture. So I feel like with these, I call them sort of universal horizons or universal landscapes, though they suggest these forms, but they are very much open to each person, hopefully bringing from their backstory of things they've seen and getting lost in them and connecting to them on this level. And yet I still want them to be abstract paintings. So they really are splitting the line between those two things.
Well, I think that science thing is really good to have in the conversation too, because the thing that, as you well know, because you did spend do spend so much time with that kind of reading material, is this idea of the fractal. Right?
Right.
And this idea that, you know, that there's a mathematics-based pattern that suggests that the whole universe is in order, as it should be. But the pattern is kind of like, it's so big before it repeats that the human brain can't really cognate it. So you kind of have to have faith, but you're having faith in math. So it is knowable, but not, and that's a really fun place to be.
Right.
But that idea that the point of that kind of mathematical formulation is that those are the things that govern the laws of nature. So that's why the macro-micro thing works. That's why when you look at the water and the way it ripples by your feet when the wave goes out at the ocean side, and when you look at the way cosmos, you know, like galaxies formulate themselves, you start to see these spirals and the rivulets, and like, is it topographical or is it, you know, a microscope, and all of that. We all know what all of that, you know, is, that science has given us. And I think that plugs in to sort of how these are made as well.
Right. I mean, there's mathematical equations to describe them, but also patterns in the earth that repeat from the very tiny to the very large. So I've always been interested in that because I want to make these paintings that give you a lot of room to move around in. You could be looking at something. I feel like the circular paintings do it more. These do tend to suggest landscape more, whereas the circles, I think of them as more abstract or maybe describing something on a very small scale or a very large scale. So you can use your imagination a little bit more. They're a little more open, but this, again, this notion of patterns that repeat across scales of nature has always been very compelling. And
no, exactly. And I think, I mean, the round ones always remind me of sort of like, you know, the tondo as a form in both Eastern and Western traditions, usually with some kind of spiritual adjacent cosmology and origin story. A picture of the universe would often be around the canvas. And, you know, and furthermore, I think that kind of mathematics is another thing, that it has a kind of, you know, corresponding relationship with a field that might be better termed like sacred mathematics, right? So you start talking about things like the Fibonacci sequence. That's in that conversation too. And so again, the only thing worse than a surfer is a spiritual surfer.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
I don't mind speaking
but
about
that idea that you're here, like, this is a safe space, like Los Angeles, and we are where you can talk about
Right.
the light, the qualities of the light inspired me. You're allowed to say that here, at least, or whatever. But also, increasingly, artists are allowed to just acknowledge that there might be a spiritual dimension to what is going on in their work as well.
Probably the only word other than surfing more taboo from the New York art world was spiritual.
Yeah,
I remember there was a show at LACMA.
Just go home, honestly.
In 1986, which I saw when I was already living in New York. I was visiting LACMA, and Maurice Tuckman put together the show. I still think it's one of the most amazing museum shows, called Spiritual and Abstraction. It couldn't have been more out of vogue in New York. People were literally making fun of it. But it was the first time I ever saw work by Hilma af Klint, who now everyone knows. I'd never seen these paintings before. I don't think they'd ever been shown in the States before.
And now, what we just have, that incredible show just now with Agnes Pelton and Emil Bystrom.
Yeah,
and
all painters
now
that I love.
we're owning it, right?
Yeah.
And I love that for us, but I also love that for you. Because I feel like that's a conversation that you've been being ready to have this whole time.
Without a doubt.
And finally, the center has kind of moved to where that is completely fine to talk about. And we can go to New York and be like, yeah, it's beautiful. I'm so sorry for you.
And I want someone when they're in front of one of these paintings to have, again, very out of vogue word, transcendent experience. I want something that moves people, and that hopefully for the second you're seeing it, it's improving your life right at that second. Like, it's taking you somewhere. It's taking you on a great adventure in your mind, and it's kind of a magical moment.
Well, if it makes them nervous, you can make them nighttime paintings, right? So it's like they're dark. And maybe it's beautiful, but you can't tell it's back there. No? Well, it's funny because we did also talk about beauty in the context of like today's world, right? And this idea, and in all seriousness, I think this is where it came from in New York too, is that the New York art world was so informed and shaped by people who like literally fled the Holocaust, that of course there was going to be a kind of darkness and a kind of pensiveness and a European kind of seriousness and relationship to classicism, like definitionally. So it makes sense. But I think we're living in another moment where like things are so crazy and horrible and ugly, and art kind of has a choice at that moment to like, take up arms and engage the fight, super valid, or to hold the line for creating some oasis of beauty and humanity where we can find respite from the nonsense. And that is equally incredibly valid and necessary. And, I think that that's like being in that space is something to be proud of.
Thank you. No, again, it's a crazy world out there. So these are a little bit of a respite and hopefully take you somewhere in your mind that's just a step above your daily matter.
No, they're gorgeous. Did we? Oh my
So
God, we've been talking for like 45 minutes.
I think we can.
Did you want to check your list, or do you feel like
I'm good? I think we covered a lot.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you.